Hi, my name is Allison Bainbridge, and it is my pleasure to welcome both our live audience and our viewers watching virtually to our book passage event this evening. There has been a lot of buzz about the latest book from author Stephen Johnson, including here in our bookstore among the staff. Unfortunately, we have all been waiting with bated breath to read it, and it just came out today. In fact, I understand this is the launch event for this book, so we are very honored. The book is called The Infernal Machine. Author Stephen Johnson is a leading authority on innovation and the best-selling author of 13 books about history of health, medicine, and technology. He's also created a really interesting AI project with Google called the Notebook LM. Maybe he'll talk a little bit about that. So we are fortunate that Stephen calls Marin County his home part of the year because he's been here many times to talk about his books. He also resides part-time in Brooklyn, my second favorite place to live. An Infernal Machine is a sweeping account of the anarchists who terrorize the streets of New York and the detective duo who transform policing to meet the threat. A tale of fanaticism, forensic science, and dynamite from the best-selling author of The Ghost map. From the description, you might think that you are about to read a thriller, mystery, a work of fiction. But like so many things in the past and the present, unfortunately, truth is stranger than fiction. In the vein of Hampton Sides, David Grann, and Eric Larson, Stephen makes history into a fascinating read with mystery and intrigue. In fact, Eric Larson describes An Infernal Machine as a fast burning fuse of a book, every page bursting with revelatory detail. Stephen's engrossing account of the epic struggle between the anarchist movement and the emerging surveillance state stretches around the world and between 2 centuries, from Alfred Nobel's invention of dynamite and the assassination of Tsar Alexander II to New York City in the shadow of World War I. He is a gifted storyteller, a deep thinker, and an impeccable researcher, and I cannot wait to read the book and to hear what he has to say today. Please give a warm welcome to Stephen Johnson.
Hey, gang. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. I see some old familiar faces and some new faces. And thanks, everybody. Well, sorry about that. Everybody online, thank you for tuning in. As you just heard, this is the inaugural launch event for the book. I have not spoken in public about this book before, so all this material is kind of trial material. You could give me feedback afterwards. But I am super excited about this one. And what I thought I would do is tell you a little bit about of how I got to this particular project and this story, and then tell you a little bit about what I learned from writing this book. And then I'll actually kind of end by just reading a couple of passages to give you a taste of it, and then happy to answer any questions and chat and sign books. So this one was another book in the mode of the kind of narrative history books that I've written at various different points in my career. This is book number 14, which seems kind of crazy. And they've been, as some of you may know, they've been on a lot of different topics. They have discussed everything from cholera in the 19th century to neuroscience to video games to piracy and a million other things. 3 or 4 of them have been mostly history books, multi-threaded history books where there's a lot of multidisciplinary thinking and kind of interweaving plots happening in them. And I really like that format. It's the most fun to write and to research. There's just something, just every day, it's a delight to work on a book like that. And so I had written a book generally in that mode previous to this one, Enemy of All Mankind, which is a story about a 17th century pirate, Henry Every, and that brings in a whole host of other themes about the birth of multinational capitalism and the history of piracy and international law and the history of India. And so, having kind of wrapped up that book, I was casting about trying to find a similar story that I could build an interesting kind of narrative and explore themes that I was interested in telling the story. And I thought that, that there was something intriguing about crime, right? True crime is quite a popular genre these days. And so there was a crime at the center of Enemy of All Mankind. And so I thought maybe there was something there. But the other thing I've always been interested in, as some of you know, is the history of ideas and the history of innovation and the story of how new ideas come into the world, how new scientific breakthroughs come into the world, how new technologies come into the world, the forces that make them possible or thinkable or imaginable at a certain moment in time, trying to understand that process and tell those kinds of narratives. And so I started to think that maybe there was an interesting book to be written about the early days of forensic science and how crime fighting became a kind of an information science as well as just, kind of the muscle of 19th century police departments, which were not really intellectual or investigative in any way. They were just basically a bunch of kind of more or less mob enforcers, particularly in a city like New York. And so I was interested in thinking about like how did we develop things like fingerprint technology and biometrics and information science? How did that become part of what it meant to be a police officer or a detective? And I was also interested in maybe trying to set the book in New York because I had written bizarrely, somewhat embarrassingly, like way more about, for instance, London than I had written about New York, even though I spent most of my adult life living in New York. And so I thought it would be nice to finally write a New York book. And so I started digging around about like how the NYPD as an institution got transformed into a kind of a modern police force, transforming it from the kind of Tammany Hall days to something more sophisticated. And I stumbled across this really interesting figure who turns out to be, in the end, a major figure in Infernal Machine. It was this detective named Joseph Farreau, who was one of the pioneers who kind of brought over these European methods of identification systems, of fingerprinting, and was much ridiculed when he brought them over from people like Alphonse Bertillon in France and Scotland Yard. He would kind of come over and say, well, the Europeans are actually taking people's thumbs and pressing it on a piece of paper and using that to identify them. And people were like, what are you talking about? That makes no sense. It's a fad. And so there was a kind of an interesting story there about how institutions change and evolve and like how they slowly kind of adopt new ideas from outside and how they get persuaded to reinvent themselves. And Farreau was this kind of interesting figure, and he was involved in a couple of like high profile, kind of somewhat brutal murder cases. So I thought, well, that will be interesting to write. And I wrote actually a couple of proposals for this version of the book, and it was just ultimately like too small, right? It felt too much like there was just basically like the cops versus the serial killers, and there was a story about forensic science, but it didn't feel like comprehensive enough. Didn't feel like the kind of book that I would write. And so I spent about a year just kind of circling around this kind of period and a couple of these figures without really knowing what I wanted to do with it in the end. And one of the things that I kept stumbling across as I was going through the newspaper archives, and there's so much newspaper archival research, all of it now possible online, which is an incredible time saver in this book. As I would scan the pages of these newspapers from, 1910, 1915, I kept noticing that like every other day, a bomb was going off. I mean, it was just this incredible amount of terrorism. Some of it political terrorism, some of it mob terrorism in a sense, because people were bombs were like what the extortionists would do. Is if you didn't pay up, they would put a small bomb in front of your storefront. So it was just kind of sitting there as someone who had lived in New York for so many years, had lived through 9/11. In New York, had actually the third day home with our newborn baby, our firstborn son, was 9/11. So we'd seen terrorism in New York, but to like imagine living in a city where almost every day someone was detonating a bomb somewhere, where that was just like life in the big city, was shocking. I later found the chief kind of bomb disassembler for the NYPD was this guy named Owen Egan, who's a kind of a minor character in the book. He worked as the chief bomb expert from about 1895 to 1921. And during that period, when he died of natural causes on the job, which was a surprise, it turned out that he had either examined the wreckage of or disassembled 7,000 bombs in New York City alone. So, when I kind of like began to realize the magnitude of this like daily violence in the city and how much of it was tied to, kind of political events, I started to think, well, that's something else here. Like, this is not just like cop investigates the, salacious murder, but something more interesting is going on. And so that got me starting to think about who was setting off the bombs and how they had gotten interested in that kind of terrorism in the first place. And that got me to the whole history of the anarchist movement, which was from that period from kind of 1880 until 1920, one of the dominant, if not the dominant radical political movement in the United States and in Europe, had a huge presence in the kind of geopolitical stage, led in the United States by two extremely interesting, though flawed people, Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, who had been inspired by someone I had written about a little bit in the past, Peter Kropotkin, the Russian evolutionary scientist slash geographer slash anarchist philosopher slash prince. I mean, just this amazing kind of 19th century figure who had a hand in a million different things, who basically was one of the early kind of prophets of the anarchist movement. And it had this vision, which I think is largely lost now in our sense of what anarchism was, that as he surveyed, kind of the increasing dominance of the industrial West and the factory system, and with all of its attendant brutality, that Kropotkin became increasingly convinced that there was a better model for the way that society could be organized. That was basically the kind of the free cities of the Renaissance, the kind of village communities, kind of hill town communities, artisanal guild communities. A lot of language that would actually play very well in 2024. And he thought that there was just a better way to organize society, that you didn't need big corporations and you didn't need big government. That you could build these much more egalitarian, smaller scale communities where people worked for themselves or worked in small collectives. And he became the kind of the great champion of that. And he tried to tie it into Darwinian theories. He was developing this idea of mutual aid, and the idea of kind of collaboration being an important part of evolutionary history. So suddenly I was in this world of like Kropotkin and Goldman and Berkman and a kind of a political philosophy that had largely vanished from mainstream discussions, right? I mean, one of the problems with anarchism today is that it just doesn't fit on the kind of traditional left-right map of where, are you pro-big government or are you anti-big government, right? It's like, well, I'm anti-everything. I just want to return life to the agrarian hill towns. That's not, that doesn't show up on Crossfire or whatever Crossfire is today. I know Crossfire doesn't exist anymore. So that was suddenly very interesting. And then that led me to think of like, well, how did they then get so tangled up with the bombs? Like, why did terrorism become so central to their strategy? And then it became increasingly clear that not only did terrorism become central to their strategy, but that they invented terrorism. That the model of blowing people up, blowing civilians up, blowing kind of icons of state or religious authority up to make a political point really begins with the anarchists more than any other group. There's a whole long sequence in the early stage of the book, which I had not initially planned to include, which was the assassination of Alexander II, the Russian Tsar, in 1881. He was assassinated by a nihilist slash anarchist who blew himself up next to the Tsar, thus becoming history's first suicide bomber. And triggering inspiring a wave of similar assassinations. The mortality rate of heads of state between 1881 really all the way into the 70s was just, it became way more dangerous to be either a king or a president or a prime minister during that period. And a lot of that was inspired by these anarchist assassinations. I had thought initially I was just going to do a little bit about Alexander II because, I was trying to get to New York and all these things happening, but I started reading about it and it turned out that there was this just insane, kind of almost Keystone Cops like level of mangled attempts to kill Alexander II that lead up to the ultimately successful version. Like they put dynamite under the bridge that he's going to cross over, and then the guy who's supposed to set it off falls asleep, and his alarm doesn't go off, and so it doesn't blow up. And then they bomb the train track, but they hit the train that's bringing all the fruit back to St. Petersburg, and miss the Tsar's train. I mean, it's just like one after the other, but like they clearly wanted this guy dead. There was an amazing amount of energy put towards trying to eliminate Alexander II, which was a catastrophic action. In fact, sent Russia backwards in so many different ways. But so I ended up having a big set piece about the eventual assassination of Alexander II, which I think reads really well. When I got to actually have to record the audiobook and realized that I had 2 whole chapters filled with all these Russian last names that I can't pronounce at all, it was a little bit of a, like, why did I do this? This was crazy. So the last kind of piece of it was, how did they get to this idea of blowing things up for a political cause? And that led me to the invention of dynamite. Because really this is a story, in fact, in the Times review that just ran the other day, by Clyde Haberman, he says the real protagonist of this book is dynamite, which was, I thought, a very striking thing to say. It hadn't occurred to me. So there's a whole story about, which I'll briefly read a tiny bit of, about Nobel inventing dynamite in the 1860s. And I had a moment where I briefly was like, maybe I should just write a biography of Nobel, because like his story is incredible, and I think not much appreciated. Probably now best known for the prizes and for the Peace Prize in particular, which was in many ways a kind of atonement for the carnage that his invention had unleashed on the world. The story of dynamite is one of the classic examples of unintended consequences of scientific technological innovation. I mean, as at some point in the book I say, like, no chemistry experiment of the 19th century had a bigger effect on the world, and part of that was because it was so revolutionary, as Nobel had intended, as an engineering tool, right? He thought he was making this amazing new explosive that would allow people to make tunnels through, and connect, the Transcontinental Railroad through the Sierras, and create the Panama Canal, and all these things that dynamite was used for. It was, the basic chemistry of it is dynamite is based on nitroglycerin, which had just been discovered around 1845. And everyone who messed with nitroglycerin either died, or decided that or lost a bunch of fingers, or decided that it was just not worth it, that it was too unstable. It was far more powerful than any other kind of explosive that had been developed up until that point, way more, potent than gunpowder had ever been. But Nobel got this idea in his mind that there was something possible there, and that if you could kind of tame this power, if you could create what the opening chapter is called the controlled explosion, you could turn this into an amazing tool for civil engineering. And he was so obsessed with this that he kind of pursued this for years, and in a way that I think you have to look at as kind of flawed. His younger brother was killed accidentally in an explosion in a lab that Nobel had set up outside their home in St. Petersburg. Most other budding entrepreneurs would have said, perhaps I should move on to another. But he was like, sorry about that, bro. I'm going to keep going on with my project. And eventually hit on this technique that stabilized it, and also made it very portable. And that was the extraordinary kind of asymmetric power of dynamite, is that you could walk around just as a lone individual with a stick or two in your pocket, and light it and throw it into a cafe and kill 40 people. And so what he had seen as this breakthrough for engineers who were now able to carve their way through mountains with a much smaller trove of explosives and a smaller group of employees, that same power was kind of captured by the anarchists, and they realized that they didn't need to have armies to be able to make kind of an announcement on the world stage by blowing people up. And so basically at that point I realized, okay, now I have these like 3 or 4 different tributaries that are going to all converge in New York between basically like 1913, 1914 and 1920. And I knew that there was a series of events that happened in that period that would be pretty electrifying. Um, there is a certain point in this book, for those of you who get a chance to read it, where it does kind of shift gear and it becomes kind of a thriller on some level. Like, it's certainly the most page-turnery book of any page-turnery is that phrase that I've ever written. And there's a whole kind of sequence where basically, by blowing things up in the name of a radically decentralized egalitarian society, the anarchists awaken exactly the thing they were trying to prevent, the very antithesis of all the ideals of the anarchist movement. And they basically initially trigger a movement inside of New York, inside of the New York Police Department, creating these information databases, tracking all these figures, doing these undercover operations, developing these new wiretapping technologies, which were, state of the art at the time. They create the first bomb squad on the NYPD in 1914. And just to give you a sense of how severe the anarchist threat was at the time, it was called the Bomb and Anarchist Squad. That's what it was called. Like, it was just assumed that if you were a bomb squad, you were dealing with anarchists. And eventually, all those kind of crime fighting, that kind of crime fighting apparatus, which is spearheaded both by Joseph Farreau, but also by this really interesting figure named Arthur Hale Woods, who becomes the police commissioner in 1914, who's kind of a police reformer. They build this system kind of successfully, and then that gets emulated on a federal level by a rising young former librarian named J. Edgar Hoover, and that really becomes the FBI. And Hoover's kind of first task when he joins what was then called the Bureau of Investigation is to amass enough information so that he can deport Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman to revolutionary Russia. And so that's the kind of the path you're on in this story. So that's kind of the backstory of how I got to this particular story. The thing that I've been wrestling with, and I wrote about this a little bit in my little Substack newsletter, if any of you read this, so this might be redundant a bit, but the thing I was saying in the Substack newsletter is, like, I have a lot of flaws as a writer. Like, there are a bunch of things that annoy me. Like, I'm very bad at description. I'm very bad at visually describing characters. Like, I don't really, as a reader, I always feel like whenever somebody bothers to tell me what somebody looks like, I'm like, I don't care. I'm not interested in that. That's just, how do they stir their coffee? That's fascinating. I love to hear that. And I'm not visually, my visual intelligence is not very good. So I'm always straining to make things more visual. Like, I have to work at that. And there are a couple of other, like, flaws that I have as a writer. But the thing that I love to do, that I think I'm maybe best at of all the things that I do, is basically coming up with like this, like the table of contents, basically, like the structure of the book. And like how you build something like this when you have like 5 different major through lines and literally like, maybe 50 characters. I mean, we put a cast of characters in this book for the first time because people were like, I cannot keep track of all these Russians. So how you like come up with that structure is, it's the highest level thinking that I do in writing a book. Like, what is the best way to take the reader through these complicated things? What's the best sequence for it? And the challenge with this book was, more than anything I've ever written, is that the structure wasn't innate in the material. So in the 2 books that are closest to it, Ghost Map and Enemy of All Mankind, they were both stories. Ghost Map about the discovery of the kind of solving the mystery of cholera in 1854, this investigation that Jon Snow, the doctor, does, not the Game of Thrones Jon Snow, does in the middle of this outbreak in London. And then Enemy about this pirate, Henry Every. They were not like famous stories in the way that writing a book about the Civil War is kind of, everybody knows about the Civil War, but they were stories that other books had been written about them. There were many essays that had been written about those stories, and they had a very clear chronology that was like, okay, the crime happens here, the chase happens here, the outbreak starts here, the mystery is solved here. And so I added a lot and made a lot of disparate connections around that basic infrastructure, but the infrastructure of the narrative was in place already. But it was not clear at all what kind of shape you would have if you were trying to write a book about Alfred Nobel and about Bertillon and forensic sciences and Arthur Woods in New York and Goldman and Kropotkin and all these different characters who had only been loosely associated before. And so trying to figure out, like, how do I put all of this into the same universe and make it intelligible to the reader and fun just took an enormous amount of work. And you'll see if you get a chance to read it, it has this interesting structure where for the first third or so, you are following those different trails. And I don't do a lot of hand-holding in explaining how they're all going to connect. There's a little bit in the preface, which you'll hear a bit, and a little bit of foreshadowing and things like that. But mostly you kind of go from one narrative to the other, and I don't kind of explain how it's all going to come together. And I think actually this is something that, interestingly, like, we are better at as an audience in our age of TV. Like, we now accept more complex narratives where you're like in the dark for multiple episodes about who that guy is, and you're like, no, it's going to come together. And so I was relying on that a little bit, but when people first started to read it, I mean, I remember asking you this, Jay, that, like, one of my questions was always, in that first third, do you trust that I'm going to, like, bring these threads together, or are you a little bit lost? And the balance that you have to get when you're writing a book like this is, like, you want a certain level of mystery, right? A sense of, like, how are all these things related? And mystery is about withholding information, right? That's the art of, you have to keep something from the audience. But at the same time, too much mystery is also called incoherence and boredom, right? You can't do that. And this is the really hard thing about writing books, is by the time you're making the final executive decisions on, like, whether it's working or not, whether it needs to be fixed or not, you're so bored with the material because you've read it so many times. And so you can't tell what's boring and what's exciting, what's mysterious and enigmatic, what's just confusing, because it all seems obvious to you. You're so close to it, it's kind of flattened out the whole experience. And so I was trying to get a lot of feedback from people. I think it works. I do think it works. But you guys can be the judge of that. A few things about the lessons here. I talked about unintended consequences. That has been a major kind of evolution of the way that I've written about innovation over the past 5 or 6 years. One of the big predecessors for this project was a long piece that was almost a book, actually, that I wrote for the Times Magazine last year called The Man Who Broke the World, which is about this figure. Oh my God, I'm blanking on his name. Anyway, this chemist in the 1920s who simultaneously invented leaded gasoline and the CFCs in Freon that caused the hole in the ozone layer. One guy in like 3 years. Invented both. That you can arguably, like, Thomas Midgley, arguably, like, did more damage to the entire planet than any other individual human being in history. All in the name of, like, making better products, like solving engine knock in the cars and having electric refrigerators in your kitchen. So I was interested in, like, how, what happens when technologies do things that their creators didn't originally intend. And so exploring that history with Nobel, I think, is really important. And so I think it's an important thing to be kind of reading and teaching and thinking about in an age where we're so obsessed with innovation and technological advances, getting better at kind of forecasting what those downstream unintended consequences might be. And so by looking back at the history of people like Nobel or Midgley, I think there's something intrinsically instructive in that. The other lesson of it for me is that history happens when different cultural networks collide. I mean, this is really a story about a bunch of different forces, many of them migrating from Europe to the United States. So you have this kind of forensic science tradition, you have this anarchist tradition, and terrorism as a political strategy. They all kind of, like, converge in New York, and it's that moment of convergence that makes a world-changing event. It's not really about one person. It's not necessarily even about a kind of a traditional movement, a kind of civil rights movement like explanation. It's like more that these different kind of flows of ideas happen to kind of land in the same place and time, and out of that collision, momentous things get formed. Like, for instance, the modern FBI, the modern surveillance state, all of these things that we've taken for granted in the 20th century, that kind of come out of this period. And another theme that I explored a lot in Enemy of All Mankind is the way in which these big institutions get shaped by these rogue outsiders. So part of the argument in Enemy was that the pirates, and particularly this one particular pirate, Henry Every, had helped give shape to these international legal systems and changed basically like the way in which a country like England like dealt with piracy and what had been privateering before that, and made major institutional changes in how kind of international law that came out of, like, there were probably like 1,000 practicing pirates in the world at that point, right? But they together they were enough to make a big change. Same thing with like the number of actual anarchists who were detonating bombs at that point, relatively small number of people. But they end up giving birth to these big institutions like the FBI and modern surveillance. So those are just kind of some of the things. There's so many little kind of minor themes kind of running through the book, but those are the ones that kind of came to mind just thinking about it. I want to just quickly read 2 passages and then love to answer any questions. Happy to talk about Notebook LM too, which also we had a big event this morning at Google I/O conference. So it's been a busy day for me, a little complicated managing all these different things. So the things I want to read, I'm going to read them slightly out of order. They're both from the beginning. I'm not going to give away the ending. The first is from the opening chapter called The Controlled Explosion. And I'm going to skip a few little things, but this is what it sounds like. The Controlled Explosion, August 1866, Krümmel, Germany. Seen from afar, the dunes rising up over the river Elbe, cradling the ruins of the nitroglycerin factory, appeared to be composed of ordinary sand. Only their vivid white coloring betrayed their true origins. Millions of years before, they had been living organisms, diatoms, the single-celled algae that produce more than 1/3 of all the oxygen on Earth. In the dunes looming over the Elbe, all that remained of these creatures were their exoskeletons, forming a soft powder easily carried by the wind. Each morning in the final weeks of August, a brooding, bearded man in his mid-30s made his way along the edge of the dunes to a barge anchored just offshore. The barge was a floating chemistry lab, cluttered with the tools of his trade: vials, beakers, pipettes, microscopes, thermometers, Bunsen burners, scales, powders, oils. All through the long, warm days of late summer, the man labored over his workbench, measuring and weighing and tinkering. Once or twice a day, he would venture back on land and set off what seemed from afar to be fireworks. The construction workers rebuilding the nitroglycerin factory a few thousand feet away would hear the booms reverberating across the dunes. Each time, they would pause for a few seconds, glance at each other nervously, wondering if Alfred Nobel had finally managed to blow himself up. The sand, the diatom sand is the missing ingredient that enables him to control the nitroglycerin. So he's working there trying to get it right, and all of a sudden he realizes the solution is all around him in these dunes. That's why I begin with these random dune descriptions. Okay, then this is the end of the preface. So basically I've set up that there's this clash between the anarchists and this new kind of information-based policing that's happening. And this is how the preface ends. Both of these things were, despite everything I said to you about me not being a very visual writer, I thought of them both as very cinematic moments where if you've seen There Will Be Blood, that opening sequence where Daniel Day-Lewis is like just alone trying to find oil for 20 minutes before anybody talks. Like that's what I imagine for Nobel. And this you'll see I had to like, oh, I need to have a tracking shot in this. So you'll see I tried to like write a tracking shot, which is something I've never done before. So struggle between these two different forces. If you had to select the one point on that timeline that marked the apex of the struggle between anarchism and the surveillance state, the point where you might get even odds as to how it was all going to turn out, you could make a good case for the night of July 5th, 1915. Despite the late hour, the Identification Bureau was bustling with activity. A bomb had detonated 2 days earlier in the U.S. Capitol building. The financier J.P. Morgan Jr. had been attacked at his home in suburban Long Island the following morning, and the detectives had just discovered that the suspect in both crimes had recently purchased 200 sticks of dynamite in New York, only 6 of which had been accounted for. For weeks, Joseph Farreau had been receiving death threats in the mail from anarchist groups, reminding the detective of the fast-approaching one-year anniversary of one of the most devastating explosions in the city's history, a blast that destroyed an entire apartment building on the east side, the work of anarchists plotting an attack on another titan of industry. That damage had been wrought with only a few sticks of dynamite. The trove of explosives currently missing threatened to make the previous year's blasts look like a bottle rocket by comparison. But the clash between the anarchists and the NYPD was not only visible in the frenetic activity inside the Identification Bureau. To see it in its full scope, you needed to leave the file cabinets and the fingerprint studios behind, walk out the plate glass doors into the hall, venture down a set of fire stairs into the darkened hallways of the basement. There, you would have seen a cheap suitcase leaning against a doorway. Below the muffled hum of activity in the Identification Bureau directly above, if you listened very intently, you might just have heard the quiet metronome of a ticking clock. Oh, nice timing there. So that is my introduction, the first ever, to the Infernal Machine.
Now we can take questions or comments. Anybody have a question?
So, what is the biggest lesson from the book and all of your analysis for today?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jay. I mean, I think the one that really I don't have I'm not sure if it is a lesson, but it's a way of thinking about it, which is where we are in our particular moment in terms of violence and polarization in this country. So one of the things that I think that is somewhat contrarian, I think, but I believe it is true from my studies of history, such as they are, is that when you look at a period like this, or when you look at a period like the 60s or the 70s, or you look at a period like in many ways the 50s, most periods in the 20th century American history, compared to those periods, we live in relatively tranquil political times. It sounds weird. It sounds louder. The divisions are louder on cable media, cable social media, and cable news. But both, if you think about political violence, yes, January 6th is a real thing, and so I'm going to get to that in a second. But in general, obviously, we do not live in a world where there are 7,000 bombs going off in New York City over 20 years. The assassination levels, I mean, there's just like the rate of assassination was just far, far higher. People just were getting killed all the time. If you were head of state, like when Roosevelt, there's a scene about McKinley getting assassinated, and which Emma Goldman was adjacent to, and Teddy Roosevelt assumes the office because he was vice president. And there's a line in there where it's like, from an actuarial point of view, this was not a promotion because 4 out of the last 7 had been murdered on the job. So just imagine living through that, like today, where just like one after another, these figures are getting killed and bombs are going off everywhere. And the other part of it is in terms of polarization, like what the Overton window is. This is this term for like the window of kind of semi-acceptable political beliefs. You kind of have the left and the right here, and I don't know. 30 years ago, gay marriage was nowhere in the Overton window, and then the window shifted, and now more than 70% of Americans support gay marriage, stuff like that. the Overton window in 1914, one side was like, hey, we would like to eliminate all capitalism and all government and return to 15th century, like medieval, Renaissance level, artisanal guild-based villages. And the other side was like, we think it's totally fine to gun down striking workers who are opposed to the idea of a 12-hour workday, right? Like that was the range, right? And so I think it's a helpful reminder a little bit of that, the assumption that this is a particularly tumultuous time. At least for the last 20 or 30 years, we've actually lived through a relatively calm time. But the other side of it is like, how do those periods begin, right? Like maybe we're just at the beginning of the next one. And so that's part of why I tried to, I don't have an easy answer for this, but I tried to go spend the time trying to figure out how that wave of violence, crested. What were the forces? I'm going to try and keep this aquatic as a metaphor. Those forces that were pushing that wave upwards, where did they come about to maybe give us a sense when we look at what's happening now, like, is that possible again? And is there some, 21st century dynamite that could unleash these forces again? I don't know the answer to that, but I feel confident that revisiting these kinds of histories and thinking about that, our present moment in the context of these histories, is an important thing to do. Okay. Yeah. We have to bounce back and forth between online.
Yes. So that leads to a question actually that I was going to ask, and someone online is asking. This book is about dynamite, a new invention of its day, and you also work with AI. What parallels, if any, do you see in your work as both a researcher and an innovator? And I'm wondering if AI is similar to dynamite in that it was created with the idea of, for benevolent use, and yet we are already seeing some destructive.
Yeah, I see zero parallels. No, what an absurd question. No, I'm kidding. I don't want to take it lightly. So the way I think about it is there 100% are parallels in the sense that I believe that artificial intelligence is a revolutionary technology, that it is a significant advance and breakthrough, and we are able to do things with computers that were unthinkable 2 years ago. In many ways, I got involved with this Google project precisely because of that there were all these things that we could build, including this kind of dream research tool that I've been fantasizing about for 30 years and now is possible because of language models. And I think there's plenty of reason to think that that it will be a positive development for society, but there is no question, no technology this powerful comes without some kind of unanticipated cost. And so the two things you can do if you are confronting a technology like that, if you feel that it shouldn't be stopped because it does offer so many benefits, the two things that I decided to do was to, one, continue studying the patterns of history and understand how these things have gone wrong in the past, and to think about how we build better kind of forecasting systems for imagining the downstream consequences, which I wrote about a little bit in my book Farsighted. And then also getting involved, like trying to steer it towards the outcomes you want. And so that's why I've been involved in this project with Google. But I will say that I personally am not concerned about the more severe negative consequences from large language models as they are today. I do not think they are an existential threat to humanity in some ways. I think they pose all sorts of problems in terms of video, like deepfakes and things like that, and there's an economic implication for jobs and all that stuff we'll have to figure out. But I do not believe that the foundation of language models as they are today is capable of kind of rogue AGI, kind of runaway superintelligence that people are worried about. There may be some future development in AI that gets to there, but that will be, that's like saying don't work with computers in 1985 because at some future point these computers may turn into rogue AGI, and that would be a dumb thing to do in 1985. I think it would be a dumb thing to do in 2024, whatever year we're in. So that's how I think about it. But it certainly, it was in the back of my mind that it was interesting to live in these two parallel worlds. I spent so much time, like 130 years ago, exploring this set of ideas, and then be here in the present day, right in the middle of this new revolution. Okay, back to the room.
Yeah, since you've looked at different eras of society and how innovation has affected them, do you have a perspective on the rate of change and how that has had positive and negative effects, and whether the rate of change, we always think that innovation's happening the fastest now, but
Yeah.
people back 200 years ago and trains came along, that was a massive change.
Yeah.
So any perspectives on that?
Yeah, it was a terrific question. We could talk about this all day. I'll say two things about it. One of the things that is very interesting in thinking about why the anarchists were saying what they were saying in 1890 or 1900 or 1910 is that the countries like the United States and most of the countries in Europe had gone through this unbelievable change of industrialization. And, in terms of like the transformation of the built landscape around people and the transformation of their basic work patterns, I think that was clearly a bigger change than anything that we've lived through, right? It's one thing to be like, oh, wow, everyone's now has kind of slightly thinner phones versus like, wow, I was working on a farm and now I just lost my arm in this factory, and I'm living in this city that didn't exist 15 years ago that has no plumbing. That was an extraordinary change, and it was an incredibly violent change. And I've written about this in a couple of books actually. When like everywhere industrialization took root, life expectancies dropped. Unbelievable workplace accidents literally exploded in some cases. And so the part of the justification that the anarchists made in resorting to violence was effectively of the kind of they started it kind of argument. Like our little bombs are nothing compared to what happens every single day in every factory around the world. But the other part of it that I hadn't thought about until I really kind of dug into it, and there's this kind of a set piece in the middle of the book where Kropotkin and Goldman meet up in Kropotkin's little suburban house outside of London. That's actually one of my favorite parts of the book. And I kind of make the argument there, which had kind of come to me after a while, which is like the anarchists could make this case for returning to the kind of artisanal villages because the factory system was so new. Like it had all changed in one generation, basically. Like they'd gone from like working on the farm to like working in the factory in 30 or 40 years in a lot of places. And so it seemed like, well, if you can change that fast, we can go in another direction too. Like this is not inevitable. The future is like up for grabs here. If you can reinvent everything in the name of the industrial age, we can reinvent it in the name of the anarchist age next, And I think that that's one of the things we've lost, where the system is too big now to like really reinvent it on some level. It's just too hard to imagine, but it was still new then. And so I see that period as a period of like, intense change. The other thing I'll say is, my little Substack newsletter is called Adjacent Possible, which is a term that I didn't come up with, Stuart Kaufman came up with, but I used it in my book, Where Good Ideas Come From. And it's basically kind of a model of how innovation works. At any given point in history, based on the technology of the day and the science of the day and the culture of the day, there are a set of like possible new things that can be invented. And that over time, that possibility space has widened as more and more things are out there. But you can't kind of leap forward. Like you can't invent a microwave oven in 1650. Like it's just not part of the adjacent possible. It's not imaginable as a thing. But suddenly in the mid 50s, it becomes imaginable because these various technologies, which I could not identify, have been invented. Like electricity, that's one. And so, but the thing that I kind of realized a couple of months ago coming out of this and thinking about AI as well is, what happens, the pattern that happens is that the adjacent possible like widens and contracts at different moments. And so there are kind of periods where like things get kind of stable and the number of new things you can do get kind of limited in a weird way. Like you're just kind of like, we're in this pattern. We have our smartphones, we have our social media apps, and everybody's just kind of like modifying the edges of things, but not doing anything big. And so that's a narrow period. I think we were living through that period for like the last 8 or 9 years. And then what's happened with language models is all of a sudden the adjacent possible just got huge. And there's just all these things that we can do that we couldn't think about doing. There are all these things to explore and to figure out. And so that's the thing I would say is like there's both this a rate of change phenomena, like how much did it change compared to what my kids or my parents lived through. And then there's a expansion and contraction of possibility is another way of thinking about it. And both those things vary. Okay, do we want to go back to the we're going to go back to the back. So Mr. Margolin.
So I'm not sure how much terrorists think about their branding opportunities, but it does seem to me, and I wonder if you'd comment, that terrorism is kind of inevitable in a sort of imbalanced power situation, and therefore counterterrorism, the sort of cat and mouse game that's played, is inevitable. And I guess I wonder if you'd address that, and also if the anarchists could have chosen a better brand.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a great point, David. So a lot of this is actually, I mean, the way you put it there, a lot of this is dialectics, right? I mean, there's this thesis and an antithesis, and it creates a synthesis, right? And so it's Hegel and it's Marx on some level. But I guess part of it is trying to figure out, like, really, how does that work in practice, right? Like, that's I like trying to build stories that animate that process. So a lot of kind of historical stories are anchored on, individual people. And so there's kind of a protagonist, and you're following the arc of their life, and they're overcoming adversity, or they're kind of figuring out to get their vision. Or sometimes there's like a movement kind of story, or there's a kind of a military campaign where the natural like arc of the story is like they have to win this battle, and they fight and overcome adversity, and they win the battle. This is a story about really where the protagonists are kind of maybe dynamite, but also just ideas, and how those ideas clash, and then one kind of wins out over the end. And so that movement of like terror and counter-terror, and maybe the inevitable victory of the state over these kind of forces, that's the trying to figure out ways to make that into compelling history and a page turner is like, that's what gets me up in the morning, is because I think those are important lessons to learn, but trying to make it interesting to read is the challenge of it. The branding thing is really interesting, because the word anarchy, when it was originally being used by Kropotkin and the others and Proudhon and those people in the 1860s, it did not have the connotation of, chaos and disorder in a negative sense. It just meant anarchos, like no rulers. So it just meant like a world without rulers. And it became, now when we think of it, like it means, oh God, that's anarchy, it's crazy, like it's bad on some level. It developed that negative connotation because the anarchists kept blowing things up again and again and again. And so there's a line in the book where it's like, it was the worst branding campaign in the history of politics. Like they turned their name against their cause, But I think, but to your question, like the thought experiment, which is just a brief thought experiment at the end of the book, the book does not have a big closing chapter that's like, what does this all mean today? By the way, it does it a little bit, but it doesn't do that because there is such a great little plot twist epilogue that history gave me that I was like, I can't distract anybody. I have the best thing where a character shows up that you think has been long gone, and it's so good. That's all I'm going to say. But the one thought experiment was, what if Kropotkin had become the patron saint of the radical left instead of Marx? And what if the radical left vision in the 20th century was, let's slow down technology, let's slow down big government, let's slow down big corporations, let's live in a more human scale. And that was the counter argument to state capitalism. What would have happened? It probably would have lost, but it would have been a very different 20th century, right? And so that's the question, is like, was there a way for the anarchists to get to making that argument, but using, say, like, Gandhi was inventing, or not inventing, but partially inventing nonviolent protester in the same period. So they could have gotten to that potentially on their own, and maybe that would have been more persuasive, and maybe then it's not a story about state communism versus state capitalism, it's some other narrative. I don't know what it would have been, but it would have been different. Yeah. Okay.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you. I can't wait to read this book. I love the idea of this idea that the history of innovation is a history of controlled explosions. But my question is about your next book and how you might employ a large language model to produce it, and what Stephen Johnson will be able to write in 10 years that an LLM can't.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've been so very briefly. Notebook LM basically is a tool that lets you upload whatever sources of material that you're interested in. So if you're an author, it might be your research material, and you can upload this to a notebook, and it can be PDFs, it can be docs, it can be whatever, increasingly visual information too. And the moment you upload that information into your notebook, the large language model is effectively, it's not really trained, but it's like it's become an expert in the material you've given it. And particularly with these new models like Gemini, the sophistication, it's like it's like having an incredible research assistant, right? Where you can just be like, what are the most interesting things about dolphins in everything that I've ever read, you know? And it's like, oh, sure, here I've picked the 5 most interesting things, and here are the original sources, and I've collated it all for you. What else would you like, right? That's like unthinkable 2 years ago. Now it just happens every single day on my computer. So when I was first messing around with the early versions of Notebook, it was a lot of like, find me this information and collate it. But they've gotten smarter. The models have gotten smarter. And so now I'm kind of in this mode casting about for the next history book. I might maybe write something about AI potentially and this whole experience I've been on, but I'm really excited to figure out what the next book is. And so I'm like reading very widely in a bunch of different places. But one thing that was in the back of my mind was like, maybe I'll write something about California because I've written about New York now. And maybe I'll write, is there some like Stephen like book about the gold rush and the gold rush period? That's not just a history of the gold rush, but could I find some interesting way into it? Always been fascinated with 1848 as a year, a very interesting revolutionary year, you know, so I read this wonderful book actually called The Age of Gold, I think it is, that came out like 20 years ago. And I grabbed all the quotes from that book that I had highlighted reading in an ebook. And I put those into Notebook LM, which you can do because we're not training the model, so it's not in a copyright infringement and stuff like that. I paid for the book. I can use it inside of Notebook LM. And I loaded it in its notebook. And this was the thing that wouldn't have been possible a year ago, even with this tool. I was like, my kind of prompt for the model was, I'm Stephen Johnson, the author of such books as The Ghost Map and The Enemy of All Mankind, that are multi-threaded history books, multidisciplinary. I'm thinking about writing a new book, maybe about the gold rush. I've just read this book. Here are the quotes I collected from it. What do you think? Is there something there? And it was pretty good. I was like, what are the angles that I could have with this material? And it came up with 4. They were a little bit vague. It wasn't brilliant, but the one thing I would say is that the fact that when I was reading this book, that I kept telling people over like a glass of wine or a coffee when I would meet them, was that when Sutter struck gold in 48, 49, obviously there was no railroad connecting California. Thus, there was no telegraph connecting California and the East Coast. And thus, the speed of information was such that news of the gold rush arrived in Australia and China and Chile months before it got to Washington and New York. Because you had to the only way to get the information there was to sail it around or go down to Panama and go across land to Panama, whatever. Whereas you could sail directly to Sydney, and be there in 2 weeks or whatever it was, and you'd be like, hey, there's gold. So all these Australians and Chinese like arrived in San Francisco before the president of the United States knew that there was gold in California, right? I'm selling you on this new book already. This is good. So my point is, in Notebook LM's response, the first thing that it flagged was that fact. It was like, this was pretty cool, and it quoted directly from the passage, whatever. And I was like, okay. There's a scene in Jurassic Park where the hunter who's managing the velociraptors is about to die at the hands of the velociraptors he's trained, and they basically outsmarted him, and his last lines are, clever girl. And then the velociraptor goes, I say that all the time to my computer.
We have time for one last question.
One more AI question for you, Stephen. You talked a little bit about Notebook LM. What specifically did you do in the writing of Infernal Machine using either Notebook LM or other generative AI tools?
Yeah, I used it. So Notebook is, Infernal was 4 or 5 years in the making. And so we didn't have a working prototype of what was originally called Tailwind, which is the predecessor of Notebook, until October of, then we previewed it in the near future, until October of 2022. And so I had already started writing it, and I had collected all the research, but I did bring all my quotes into those early versions of it, and I used it quite a bit, just as basically like the greatest like internal search engine you've ever had. Like, because it's the beautiful thing about the language models is you're no longer thinking of like, what is the exact phrase that I'm looking for? Command F, I got to find this. You're just like, there's a thing about a kid, like, and he's maybe wearing a shirt, like whatever, and they're like, oh yeah, I know it. Here it is, And so it was great for that kind of stuff, but I didn't do a lot of the more kind of advanced, creative, kind of collaborative things that are possible. But I'm very interested in what will happen next. And I mean, I can kind of take it to, I forgot to answer like Amanda's more challenging question is like, what's going to happen to Steven Johnson in 10 years? He's going to retire and his bots are going to write his books for him. No, I think there is going to be an amazing period, and I just don't know how long this period is, where I'm just going to get better at my job. I really believe that. I think that period is at least 5 years. Like I'm going to be able to do, I mean, it reminds me of like, I had a huge leap forward once you could, most of your research materials were online. So things that used to take weeks to go to the library and Xerox the magazine article or just figure out if the magazine article existed, all those things that suddenly you were just like, hello, Google Scholar, like I'm just going to find it and there it is. Like that, we're going through another amplification like that. And so it's just, I'll be able to like have richer, more complex ideas. I'll synthesize better. It'll be better grounded in the facts. All those things will be better for a long time. Is there some suddenly imaginable future where I'm kind of like more of a director, choreographer, and there's and I'm kind of like, hey, Notebook version 12, I'm dreaming of an intro that kind of is like a tracking shot but I can't quite write it. Could you give me a draft of that? And I'm tweaking the model's first draft. Like, is that imaginable? Yes. Would I do that? I probably not. I would probably want to write it, but it's a fascinating open question. And what society is going to be like, what our expectations are like about what, yeah. So, but I think in the short term, when used in this way, the thing I keep always coming back to with something like Notebook LM is these tools, if you are interested in understanding something, these tools give you superpowers at that. They can really help you understand. You can dive in, you can have conversations, you can have follow-up questions, you can do all that kind of stuff that it's just, unless you have a personal tutor, you can't do. If you are interested in bypassing understanding and giving the illusion of understanding, so you can use them for that too. But I'm not interested in that. So for me, it's just a big win. I want to understand this stuff better. And now I have this, this really good friend of mine who is able to help me do that. So that's my cautiously optimistic take on it.
Well, thank you. Good place to stop here.
Thanks for coming out, Tess.
We appreciate cautious optimism. So thank you. And I can't imagine a world where Steven Johnson is a bot. So let's just continue to have you write your fantastic books. Thank you so much. Thank you to those of you who watched online and those of you who are here live. And Steven's going to be here to sign your books.